HOA neighbor breaks into my garage to seize my classic car, but faces my gun-toting grandma. It all began when we moved into the neighborhood. After spending years living in a cramped apartment, Rachel and I were eager to start fresh. We found a charming, three-bedroom house in a quiet suburban area with well-manicured lawns and tree-lined streets. The kind of place where you could finally own a house without the constant noise of city life, and where the biggest excitement seemed to be an HOA meeting or the occasional neighborhood barbecue. I'd always dreamed of owning a classic car, and the house we bought came with a two-car garage. A perfect place to store and work on my pride and joy, a 1969 Ford Mustang Fastback. It wasn't just any car. This Mustang was a project I'd been restoring for years. Every detail had been painstakingly thought through, from the custom paint job to the upholstery. But the real work had been under the hood. The original engine had long since given out, so I decided to swap it for something more powerful, a 302 cubic inch V8 from a 1970 Mustang. It wasn't just an upgrade, it was my vision coming to life. It was a quiet Saturday when I decided to install the new engine. The sun was high, and it seemed like the perfect day to work on the car. After a few hours of wrenching, I had everything in place. The Mustang's new engine roared to life, and I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. It was more powerful than I had imagined, and everything sounded perfect. But I didn't realize how loud it was until I took it for a quick test drive down the street. The engine rumbled with authority, shaking the air around me. I revved it a little just to feel the power. That's when I noticed Greg, the neighbor across the street. Greg was always outside, whether it was working on his yard or just standing in his garage, keeping an eye on things. I hadn't really thought much about him at first, but now, I couldn't ignore the way he was glaring at me from his driveway. "Hey, mind turning that down a bit? Some of us are trying to enjoy the afternoon in peace," he yelled, shaking his head in frustration. I wasn't sure if he was angry about the noise or just trying to make a point, but I figured it was better to head back inside before it escalated. I parked the Mustang in the garage and went inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was watching me. I hoped it was just my imagination. After all, it was just a loud engine, right? He'd get over it. But I was wrong. The next morning, I found a letter from the HOA in my mailbox. They had received a noise complaint, specifically about my car's engine. It was a formal notice, warning me that I needed to fix the issue or face fines. I was stunned. The noise hadn't been excessive, at least not by car enthusiast standards. I had worked hard to keep everything within the rules, but now it seemed like Greg was making this personal. I didn't want to cause trouble, but the idea of being forced to change the Mustang's engine after all the effort I'd put in felt like a punch to the gut. Rachel suggested we try talking to Greg, but I knew that wouldn't work. He wasn't the type to listen. He was the kind of guy who followed rules to the letter, and it seemed like he was already on a mission to get me to comply. Then, the next day, I saw him walking up to my front door. He didn't knock, just stood there, glaring. "Something's got to be done about that car," he said, pointing to the garage. "It's disturbing the peace around here. The HOA has to get involved if you don't do something about it." I could feel the tension rising in my chest. This wasn't just about a noise complaint anymore. Greg was determined to get me to change my car's engine, and he wasn't going to stop until he did. The way he spoke, like he had some kind of authority, made it clear that he was willing to take things further. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. The next day, I decided I wasn't going to let Greg bully me into giving up my car. Rachel could see the frustration in my face as I paced around the living room. She tried to reassure me, but I knew I had to do something before it escalated further. It wasn't just about a loud car. It was about standing my ground. That afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Greg was standing there again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two other neighbors from down the block, Tom and Linda, were with him. They didn't look friendly. In fact, they looked like they were all in on something, and it didn't take long to figure out what that was. "We've all been hearing your car," Greg started, his tone more forceful than the day before. "This has become a problem, and we want it fixed. It's disturbing everyone's peace. It's not just us complaining. The whole block is talking about it." I tried to remain calm, but I could feel my blood starting to boil. Look, I understand it's loud, but I've spent years working on that car. It's a passion project for me. It's not some toy I can just throw away or change because you guys don't like the noise. Maybe you don't care about the neighborhood. But we do, Tom interjected. This isn't about just a car. It's about respect. We all have to live together here, and your car doesn't fit the community vibe. Linda nodded in agreement, and I could see they weren't backing down. I tried to stay composed, but the pressure was mounting. If you're all so upset, why don't we take this up with the HOA? Since you're so concerned about community vibe? That's what we plan on doing, Greg said smugly. We've already filed another complaint, and they're going to inspect your car next week. I could feel my stomach sink. The HOA had been strict in the past with rules, and I knew they wouldn't take kindly to someone challenging their authority. I had a decision to make, either back down or fight this. I wasn't about to let some overly sensitive neighbors dictate what I could or couldn't do with my property. But before I could respond, I heard a voice from behind me. Is there a problem here? It was Rachel, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, looking directly at Greg and the others. Her grandmother, my grandma, who had been living with us for the past few months, was behind her, leaning on her cane with a look of pure disdain on her face. Grandma had a reputation for being fiery, and she was never one to back down from a confrontation, especially when it involved her family. We're just trying to talk some sense into your husband, Greg said, his voice a bit less certain now that Grandma had entered the scene. Talk some sense? Grandma scoffed. Sounds more like you're trying to bully him over a damn car. My grandson worked hard on that Mustang, and I don't think you should be meddling in his business. The other neighbors were taken aback. They hadn't expected Grandma to get involved. Greg's face turned a little red, but he tried to recover. It's not just about the car. It's the noise. Noise, 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 Grandma interrupted, raising a hand. You don't like the noise? You think you own this neighborhood? Well, you don't. And neither do the HOA. There was a tense silence. The neighbors didn't know how to respond to Grandma's sharp words. Rachel stepped forward, her tone firm but calm. We'll handle it from here, Greg. Thank you for stopping by. But we don't appreciate the way you're going about this. With that, Greg and the others muttered something under their breath and left, their defeat palpable. Grandma, still holding her cane, gave me a knowing look. That's the spirit, she said with a wink. You don't let people push you around, especially over something you love. I was both relieved and impressed by how she handled the situation. But I knew this wasn't over yet. I had a bigger battle to face with the HOA. The next week, I received a letter from the HOA, as expected. They wanted to inspect the car and confirm whether it was in violation of the noise regulations. The letter made it clear that if they found the Mustang to be too loud, I'd be forced to make modifications or face fines. I wasn't about to let them dictate what I could do with my car, but the thought of fines was still a real concern. I started thinking about my options. How could I make the car less loud without losing its power or character? I knew there had to be a solution. That's when Grandma, who had been watching me mull over my options, suggested I take the car to a local mechanic who specialized in custom work. Don't mess with it yourself, dear, she said. Let someone who knows what they're doing handle it. You'll save yourself the headache. I followed her advice and made an appointment with the mechanic. After discussing the situation with him, he suggested a few modifications that would reduce the noise without compromising the car's performance. It wasn't cheap, but it seemed like the only way to avoid a confrontation with the HOA. I scheduled the appointment for the following weekend, hoping that I could solve the issue quietly before the HOA came to inspect. It was a relief to know that I had a solution, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wouldn't stop until he'd pushed me to my limits. As I made the final payment for the modifications, I received a call from Rachel. She sounded panicked. You won't believe this, she said. Greg was out in front of the house, taking pictures of your Mustang. I rushed home, furious. By the time I got there, Greg was gone, but Rachel confirmed what she saw. He was out there for at least 10 minutes, she said, her voice tense. He was taking pictures from different angles, like he was trying to document something. I felt the familiar anger bubbling up again. This was going too far. Taking pictures of my car? For what? To send them to the HOA? To make some kind of case against me? It was invasive and downright creepy. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let Greg win. I wasn't going to let him or the HOA make me feel unwelcome in my own neighborhood. That night, I sat down and did some research. I looked up HOA rules, noise ordinances, and even laws about harassment. If Greg wanted to play dirty, I needed to be prepared to defend myself. Rachel helped, combing through forums and articles, and even Grandma got involved, offering her own colorful suggestions on how to teach Greg a lesson. Most of her ideas weren't exactly legal, but I appreciated the sentiment. The next day, I decided to confront Greg directly. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also didn't want him to think he could keep walking all over me. I waited until I saw him outside, trimming the hedges in his yard. Taking a deep breath, I walked over. "Greg," I called out, trying to keep my tone neutral. He looked up, a smug expression already forming on his face. "Well, if it isn't the neighborhood hot rodder," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look, I don't want this to turn into a feud," I said, ignoring his jab. "But I need to know why you were taking pictures of my car." Greg straightened up, wiping his hands on his gardening gloves. "Oh, just making sure I have evidence for the HOA. In case they need to see what kind of disruption we're dealing with." "Disruption?" I asked, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I've already taken steps to reduce the noise. The car's not even loud anymore." "Maybe not as loud," he said, shrugging, "but it's still an eyesore. Doesn't exactly scream family-friendly neighborhood, does it?" That did it. Any attempt at diplomacy went out the window. "An eyesore? It's a classic car, Greg. It's worth more than your entire landscaping budget." His face flushed, and for a moment, I thought he might actually lose his cool. But instead, he just smirked. "We'll see what the HOA has to say about that." As I walked away, I realized something. Greg wasn't just annoyed about the car. He hated the fact that I wasn't bending to his will. This wasn't about noise or appearances, it was about control. And if that was the case, he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. The HOA inspection came and went without much fanfare. The inspector noted the modifications I'd made and seemed satisfied that the car wasn't in violation of any noise regulations. I thought that would be the end of it. But of course, Greg wasn't about to let it go. A few days later, I noticed a small scratch on the Mustang's driver's side door. At first, I thought it might have happened at the mechanic's shop, but the placement didn't make sense. It was low, almost at knee height, like someone had deliberately keyed it. Rachel noticed it too, and her face turned pale. "Do you think?" she started, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew who the prime suspect was. I didn't have proof, though, and without proof, there wasn't much I could do. Still, I wasn't about to let it slide. I installed a security camera in the driveway, making sure it had a clear view of the Mustang. If Greg, or anyone else, tried anything again, I'd have evidence. It didn't take long for the camera to pay off. A week later, I woke up to a notification on my phone. The security app showed motion detected near the car at 3 a.m. I opened the video feed and couldn't believe my eyes. There was Greg, crouched by the Mustang with something in his hand. It looked like a screwdriver. I showed the footage to Rachel, and she was just as shocked as I was. "You have to call the police," she said. But I hesitated. Was this enough to press charges? Would the HOA get involved? Would it escalate things even further? After a long discussion with Rachel and Grandma, I decided to confront Greg one last time. But this time, I wasn't going to do it alone. The next morning, I showed the video to Grandma. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Greg on the screen, crouched like some kind of amateur saboteur. "Oh, that man has crossed the line," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're not letting this slide." I didn't have to ask for her help. She was already planning her next move. Grandma had a knack for handling situations in her own unique way, and while I wasn't sure what she had in mind, I knew she wasn't about to let Greg off the hook. Later that day, Rachel and I knocked on Greg's door. To my surprise, he answered almost immediately, as if he'd been expecting us. He leaned against the doorframe, that same smug expression plastered across his face. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, feigning innocence. I pulled out my phone and played the video. His smirk faltered as the footage of him crouched by my car played out. "Care to explain what you were doing at 3 in the morning with a screwdriver near my Mustang?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Greg's face turned a shade of red I didn't know was possible. "That's ridiculous," he stammered. "I wasn't. This isn't what it looks like." "It looks like you were tampering with my car," I shot back. "And if you don't have a better explanation, I'll have no choice but to take this to the police." "You think the police will care about this?" Greg snapped, his voice rising. "They'll laugh you out of the station." At that moment, Grandma appeared behind us. She wasn't exactly subtle, carrying her trusty old shotgun. Unloaded, of course, but Greg didn't need to know that. "Morning, Greg," she said, her tone deceptively cheerful. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Greg's eyes widened, and he took an involuntary step back. "What is this? Are you trying to threaten me?" "Threaten?" Grandma said, tilting her head innocently. "Why, I'm just here to make sure we're all on the same page. You see, this is my grandson's car, and I take it very personally when someone messes with it." Greg looked between me, Rachel, and Grandma, clearly weighing his options. "Fine," he finally muttered. "I'll leave the car alone. Just keep her away from me." "Good choice," Grandma said, her smile never wavering. I thought that would be the end of it, but Greg wasn't done. A few days later, I got a letter from the HOA claiming my car was in violation of new community guidelines. Apparently, they'd held an emergency meeting, one I wasn't informed of, and passed a rule banning vehicles undergoing restoration from being parked in driveways. It was obvious Greg was behind it, but I didn't have proof. Still, the rule was ridiculous, and I wasn't about to comply. The Mustang wasn't undergoing restoration. It was fully operational and registered. I wrote a formal appeal, citing the car's status and the fact that I'd never been notified about the meeting. While waiting for a response, I moved the Mustang to the garage. I hated giving Greg the satisfaction, but I wasn't going to give him another reason to harass me. Grandma, however, wasn't satisfied. "You're letting him win," she said, shaking her head. "I'm picking my battles," I replied, but deep down I knew she was right. A week later, I came home to find the garage door open and the Mustang missing. My heart sank as I ran inside, calling for Rachel and Grandma. They hadn't seen or heard anything. Panic set in as I called the police, reporting the car stolen. When the officer arrived, I showed him the security footage. Sure enough, there was Greg again, this time brazenly towing the Mustang away with a truck. The officer took my statement and promised to follow up, but I wasn't hopeful. Greg had connections in the HOA, and I wouldn't put it past him to try to spin the situation in his favor. That evening, Grandma called a family meeting. "Enough is enough," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're getting that car back, and we're going to make sure Greg pays for what he's done." Her plan was bold, maybe even reckless, but I couldn't deny it had a certain appeal. Greg thought he could push us around, but he was about to learn he'd messed with the wrong family. The following day, Grandma was up at the crack of dawn, rallying the troops. Rachel, Grandma, and I formed an unlikely but determined team. Our first stop was the tow yard listed on the side of the truck Greg had used in the footage. Grandma was confident we'd find the Mustang there, or at least someone who knew where it had gone. The tow yard's manager, a gruff but straightforward guy named Pete, didn't seem thrilled to see us. "What's this about?" he asked, leaning on the counter as Grandma launched into the story. Pete frowned as we showed him the footage of Greg towing the car. "That truck's one of ours," he admitted, scratching his head. "But I didn't authorize a pickup at that address." "So, where's the car now?" I asked, my voice tight. Pete glanced at his logs. "Looks like it was dropped off at some private storage lot about 5 miles from here. It's not our usual spot. Seems off." Grandma didn't waste a second. "Give us the address," she demanded. Pete hesitated but finally scribbled it down. "Be careful," he warned. "If this guy went through all this trouble, he's not going to hand it back without a fight." The storage lot was as shady as they come, Chain-link fences, rusted gates, and a lot attendant who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. We spotted the Mustang right away, parked near the back under a tattered tarp. My heart raced as I saw my car, but my relief was short-lived when Greg stepped out of a nearby office. "What are you doing here?" he barked, marching toward us. "We're here for the car you stole," I said, my fists clenched. Greg smirked. "Stole? Don't be dramatic. The HOA authorized the removal. That car's a violation of community rules." Grandma stepped forward, her presence commanding. "You think you can just take what doesn't belong to you?" she said, her voice sharp. "You're in over your head, boy." Greg's smug expression faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You don't scare me, old lady," he sneered. At that moment, the police arrived. I'd called them before we entered the lot, hoping to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. The officers listened to both sides, but Greg's story quickly fell apart when Pete arrived to back us up. "This guy used my truck without proper authorization," Pete explained, glaring at Greg. "I'm not taking the fall for whatever scam he's running." The police didn't need much more convincing. They ordered Greg to hand over the keys to the storage unit where he'd stashed the Mustang's keys and documents. As we watched, Greg's bravado crumbled, replaced by a panicked, defeated look. With the Mustang back in my possession, I thought the ordeal was finally over. But Grandma had other plans. "He's not going to stop," she said. "We need to hit him where it hurts." Her idea was simple but brilliant. Expose Greg's antics to the HOA and the wider community. Using the security footage, witness statements, and Pete's testimony, we compiled a comprehensive report detailing Greg's harassment and rule-breaking. Rachel helped put everything together into a presentation that Grandma insisted on delivering at the next HOA meeting. The meeting was packed, with residents eager to hear what Grandma had to say. She didn't disappoint. With her signature mix of charm and authority, she laid out the case against Greg, ending with a simple question. "Is this the kind of person we want representing our community?" The room erupted into murmurs and head nods. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been passed to remove Greg from his position on the HOA board. The Mustang was safe, and Greg had been put in his place, but the experience left a lasting impression. It reminded me of the importance of standing up for what's right, and the value of having someone like Grandma in your corner. As for Greg, he kept a low profile after the incident, avoiding eye contact whenever we crossed paths. Grandma, of course, had the last word. "Mess with my family, and you'll wish you hadn't," she said, loud enough for him to hear as we passed his house one afternoon. I couldn't have said it better myself.